Does the rabbi consider himself a Zionist?
Well, that is a very interesting and very good question. I'm sure that many people would assume that I would immediately answer in the affirmative, that I am a Zionist, and they would probably expect me to say that I am a religious Zionist, because there is, after all, a philosophy, a stream, a school of thought within the Torah world which refers to itself as religious Zionist. The fact of the matter is that I do not refer to myself in those terms, not because the concept of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, the settling of the land of Israel, is not absolutely central in my understanding of Torah Judaism, not because I consider myself Haredi, or what is sometimes referred to incorrectly as ultra-Orthodox. It's more a question of defining our terms of reference and the essential concepts involved here. If we understand what Zionism is, or was, more precisely, because I do not really believe that Zionism exists as an ideology today, not really. As I will explain, if we understand what Zionism was from its inception, then we can also begin to discuss what religious Zionism was and is, because that does still exist, at least in the minds of those who define themselves in those terms. And then we can begin to consider the question of what exactly is religious Zionism. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin with the concept of Zionism. We all know that Zionism was a movement that came into being towards the very end of the 19th century, leminyanam, and it is of course associated first and foremost with Theodor Herzl. Herzl was an extremely assimilated Jew. That is not a judgmental statement, it is simply a statement of fact. He was brought up in an entirely assimilated, secular environment. He knew nothing about Judaism, by his own admission. He knew nothing about what goes on in a Beth Knesset, in a synagogue. It is reported, at least by some, that the first time he actually went to a synagogue and attended a Shabbat service in a synagogue was in Basel at the time of the first Zionist Congress. Whether that is in fact accurate or not, I cannot state with certainty, but it is certainly true that he had no real connection to Judaism and also to Jewish culture. All that Herzl knew was that he was Jewish by birth, by his historical ethnic connection through his ancestors to a group of people known as the Jews, but this really had almost no cultural and also no intellectual baggage that came with this identification, with this ethnic identification. And we also know, historically, that were it not for the famous case of Dreyfus in France, in his lifetime, in Herzl's lifetime, where he witnessed, as many people did, and was also enraged, which was not something that was true for all people, for all Jews certainly. He was enraged by the blatant anti-Semitism that led to the Dreyfus affair. He began to think about the state of the Jews in Europe. What would happen to them in the future, and would they be able to live their lives in these non-Jewish countries countries apparently full of people who hated them, who certainly disliked them, would they ever be able to find their place and live a full and satisfactory and satisfying, intellectually, culturally satisfying existence in these Gentile environments? And he reached the very far-reaching conclusion that the answer to these questions was no, that apparently the non-Jews would never allow the Jews to be known and identified as Jews, and yet be part and participate fully and not be discriminated against in those societies. So he reached the very far-reaching conclusion that the Jews had to start thinking in terms of establishing their own sovereign, independent existence. This was the background, this was the thinking behind Herzl's motivations and determination to bring about a major change in Jewish history. And therefore it was not surprising that many of the original supporters and fellow travelers with Herzl at the beginning of the Zionist movement were heavily assimilated Jews, such as himself, from Central and Western Europe, people like Nordau, for example. On the other hand, there were also many Jews who began to be attracted to this ideology from Eastern Europe, where by and large the Jewish population was more traditional, and even those who had ceased being religiously observant had at least grown up and experienced as young people a more traditional Jewish type of home and upbringing and education. And this also had an impact on the Zionist movement, in that when, for example, in 1903, Herzl recommended that the Zionist Congress accept the British offer of a Jewish homeland in Uganda, in Africa. He was for accepting. In fact, not only was he for it, he threatened that he would resign if this was not voted on and carried. And therefore, because people were not certain that they could continue the momentum that Herzl had created without him, many of the East European Zionists went along with this. But in fact, as soon as Herzl suddenly died, the following year, they immediately had another vote on the subject and reversed the decision, namely that we are not interested, so they said, in establishing a Jewish homeland in Uganda, or anywhere else for that matter. It has to be in Zion, it has to be in Zion, it has to be in Eretz Yisrael. Not that many of them could necessarily have explained rationally why they felt this way. Again, it was a function of their upbringing, of their education, that they naturally felt intuitively that if the Zionist movement was trying to bring about such a major change and an improvement in the state, in the condition of the Jewish people, then it has to be centered on Zion, on Eretz Yisrael. And this became the official policy from 1904 onwards of the Zionist movement. The Uganda option was dropped. With regards to religion, it is well known that the Zionist movement often claimed, very loudly in fact, that Hatzionut en la davar im hadat. In other words, Zionism has nothing to do with religion, with Jewish religion, with Torah. It is an entirely secular philosophy, which was essentially true, at least formally. ostensibly this was correct, this was true. But again, because as the years went by, more and more of the influential and more dynamic leaders of the Zionist movement after Herzl's time were those who came from Eastern Europe with the more traditional background, with more experience of and knowledge of Jewish values and notions and concepts, together with their formally and openly and officially declared secular philosophy of Zionism. Together with this, they brought with them, sometimes entirely subconsciously, they brought with them into the mix, as it were, the ideological, philosophical ferment that was going on at that time. They brought with them many essentially Jewish ideas, such as settling the land of Israel, which is not a secular notion, which is an entirely Jewish, ancient Jewish Torah-based idea, which in fact is a mitzvah, a commandment in the Torah. They, of course, did not express it in religious terms or in Torah terms, but the concept of Yishuv Haaretz, the settling of the land with the definite article, was an essential concept and a very basic tenet of Zionism. And therefore it was not surprising that some Jews, religious Jews, and even very well-known rabbis, for example, Rav Yitzhak Yaakov Reines, they felt themselves drawn to this Zionist movement because they felt that it was offering some solutions, at least, for at least part of the Jewish people, which we have to recall at that time were suffering from the Kishinev massacres and pogroms in Eastern Europe and other indications of anti-Semitism and trouble that was brewing in other parts of the world, in Europe particularly. And they felt, as Rav Reines wrote explicitly on more than one occasion, they felt that we have to somehow offer another solution, a way out of this situation for Jews who are able and willing to move away from those countries where they are being persecuted, where their lives are at risk, even if it's not the land of Israel, even if it's Uganda, some of them. Therefore, Rav Reines was in fact willing to accept the Uganda option, not because he thought that Jews belong in Uganda, as he himself wrote and explained, but because he said we have to first deal with the reality on the ground right now, which is to save Jews and to provide them with a stable existence, both materially and spiritually, in order to create a situation in which many Jews will be able to thrive and multiply in number, and eventually, as the next stage, as the next inexorable stage, bring them back to Eretz Yisrael, to the land of Israel. These were the explicit statements made, for example, by Rav Reines. So the stream or the movement known as the Mizrahi movement, which was the religious wing of the Zionist movement, was not seen from its inception necessarily. It was never openly stated in such terms, at any rate. It was not seen as a program for the Geula, for the redemption of the Jewish people. It was, however, seen as something necessary, something positive, and something which they could not afford to ignore, and that they should not deliberately count themselves out from such a movement and from such activities, but rather they felt that they should do whatever they can to facilitate and help this project forward and bring it to some kind of realization and fruition. So what we have before us is essentially something rather schizophrenic and self-contradictory. On the one hand, we have a movement called Zionism, which was defined and understood by all initially to be a secular movement, which even declared openly that it has nothing to do with religion. And on the other hand, we have religious Jews and rabbis, famous rabbis, who joined this movement and called themselves Religious Zionists, in Hebrew, Tzionim Datiim. The movement became known as Hatzionut Hadatit in Hebrew, which means the Religious Zionist movement. The problem with this, of course, is that, as I say, it is schizophrenic. There is a built-in lacuna and very real ideological and even psychological problem built into this philosophy known as Religious Zionism. Because if you are part of a movement, what was called the Zionist movement at that time, if you are part of this movement, which is openly secular and even opposed to the Torah in many ways, there were many virulently anti-religious, anti-Torah people involved in the Zionist movement, and yet you, on the other hand, are a Torah observant and very religious Jew who believes in the Torah with all his soul, then you are obviously somehow you are torn between these two allegiances, between the secular movement of Zionism and the religious and traditional system of Judaism. And because the religious Zionists were a small minority within the Zionist movement, they were always, of course, unable to influence, have any major influence in terms of policies or direction of the Zionist movement and of Zionist activities. What they could do was essentially, if you can't beat them, join them. So if the secular Zionists were training people in agriculture and related endeavors in order to prepare them for Aliyah, to migrate to Eretz Yisrael, of course this is referred to as Aliyah, not migration, which of course speaks volumes as to the traditional concepts of Judaism, which somehow made their way into the fabric of secular Zionism, whereby going to Eretz Yisrael is always described as going up to Eretz Yisrael. La'aloth, Aliyah, is to go up to Eretz Yisrael. It is not simply to migrate. It is not going from A to B. It is from going from here to here. It is going, moving towards a higher reality, a higher dimension of existence. And this was part of the secular Zionist lexicon. So if the secular Zionists are doing Aliyah, making Aliyah, and creating agricultural settlements, kibbutzim, for example, in Eretz Yisrael, then we, the religious Zionists, should be doing the same. We will try to do the same thing, and this is in fact what they did. But they always had to do so as a kind of spare tire attached to the vehicle. They were certainly not sitting in the driver's seat, nor were they in fact even one of the 4 tires on which the car was traveling. There was some kind of 5th tire that was attached to the back of the car to be used in an emergency briefly, but not something very significant. And because they did not feel that they could openly oppose the negative aspects of the secular movement of Zionism, which it was certainly true, at least for many of the leaders of secular Zionism, it was certainly true that they wished to create a new kind of Jew, a Jew who was entirely free in their terminology, free of Torah, free of religion and the old ways of the Jewish people, and they wished to create a new kind of Jew who had no real connection to traditional Judaism, to traditional Jewish culture, civilization, Torah, etc., which of course is a very difficult, in fact impossible object to achieve, because all of Jewish civilization, from Avraham Avinu almost 4,000 years ago. And from that time up to the present, all of Jewish civilization and culture and philosophy, etc., were rooted in the essential document which created the Jewish people, which is the Torah. All of Jewish existence was connected to the Jewish people being a special, unique nation with a unique and unbreakable bond to Hashem, the creator of the universe and the giver of the Torah. To create a new Jew who is somehow on the one hand Jewish but has no connection to everything that defined Judaism in the past was of course not only a newfangled idea, it was essentially, as we all can see today with our own eyes, it was an impossible task to hope that one could succeed at achieving. And this is what we see, what we have witnessed over the last 100 years, that secular Zionism was unable to create any kind of truly new Jew in the sense of creating a new form of Jewish culture and civilization and philosophy, etc., without any reference to traditional Judaism and Jewish values and ideas and texts. This is something that has not happened. What has happened is that you may succeed, if you can call that success, you may succeed in creating generations of Hebrew-speaking Jews who think like certain types and streams of intellectuals in the Western world, from Europe or other countries perhaps, people who simply accept and internalize the modalities of thought, the philosophies, the values of other cultures and other peoples who have nothing to do with us, not only with our traditions and our past, but nothing to do with our present needs either. That one can produce, but that is not really any kind of Jewish culture or Jewish civilization. That is simply, for example, an extremely liberal, Western, postmodernist outlook and way of life, spoken and described in Hebrew by Hebrew speakers, but it is not anything essentially Jewish. And this is the story of the Israeli left today as we know it. The religious Zionists were living therefore in this not terribly hospitable environment of anti-Torah sentiment and extremely people who held very, very negative views regarding the Torah and everything to do with it. And yet they tried to somehow create for themselves a certain niche within the Zionist movement and within what was going on in Eretz Yisrael. And they called themselves religious Zionists. But essentially a religious Zionist by definition therefore is a person who describes himself as a Zionist, and as we explained, this includes by definition, by the name itself implies and suggests that you accept this philosophy called Zionism, which, as we explained, is rooted in an extremely secular and assimilationist point of view. It also needs to be stated here parenthetically that for many of the secular Jews who then became Zionists, this was in fact a form of a continuation of their assimilationist aspirations. On the one hand, they wanted to assimilate. They did not want to be religious Jews. They wanted to reject everything that the Jewish people had been doing and had believed in over the millennia. But they found that they couldn't do this because the non-Jews would not accept them. This was particularly true in Russia, for example. So people like Ben Gurion, etc., came from those countries to what was then Palestine in order to continue in their assimilationist and non-Jewish way of thinking, but to do so with other similarly minded assimilationist Jews. But this assimilation now was a new form of assimilation. It was not an assimilation aimed at entering and becoming part of non-Jewish society, part of the body politic of the surrounding non-Jewish society. Rather, it was an attempt, as we explained, to try and create and redefine what it meant to be Jewish. Some kind of new secular Jew who had almost no connection to anything that was known and defined and associated with Judaism in the past. A religious person who defined himself as a religious Zionist, therefore, was essentially taking an ideology that was extremely not Jewish and not at all rooted in the Torah in any way, and somehow was convincing himself that by placing a kippah on the head of this ideology, in the same way that he wore a kippah, if he claimed that his ideology also wore a kippah, it would somehow therefore become kasher, it would become kosher, would be okay, it would be viable. And for a time, one could claim that it was viable. But just as Zionism began to unravel to the point that I believe today one cannot seriously discuss and speak of Zionism as a ongoing philosophical or political movement today, just as Zionism unraveled and dissipated and ceased to be, essentially from the day that the State of Israel was established, because from the time that Zionism decided that it was going to focus on the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, the moment this was achieved, then essentially Zionism had fulfilled itself. And from that moment to this, which is now over 70 years, Zionism has essentially been dying a very slow and prolonged death. Which of course leaves us with the question of what about religious Zionism? If Zionism itself is no longer a going concern, then what about religious Zionism? My understanding is, my feeling is, that religious Zionism also is no longer really a going concern, in the sense that it is confused, lacking direction, lacking clarity, and therefore unable really to offer a true vision and real direction to the Jewish people, which is what the religious Jews in Eretz Israel and around the world, for that matter, that is what we should consider our duty to be. But I do not think we are able to do so if we continue to label ourselves as religious Zionists. What we need to understand is that all the essential things that we believe in, if we believe in Yishuv Eretz Israel and the settling of Jews in Eretz Israel, we need to understand the simple and self-evident fact that this is not a Zionist concept, but this is a Torah concept. This is something that the Jewish people have known of and spoken about and codified as a halacha, not only as one of the halachot of the Torah, one of the concepts or precepts of the Torah, but as one of the most central concepts in the Torah. Zionism did not invent this concept of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. There are other concepts which Zionism, of course, being a secular movement, could never have really spoken of, such as, or even discussed. For example, what kind of form of governance, what kind of political system should the Jewish people be aspiring to establish in their state, in their independent sovereign state in Eretz Israel? And certainly concepts such as the Mikdash, the temple, or reinstituting the Sanhedrin, renewing the Smicha, and many other essential and elementary aspects of the Torah, which the Jewish people have always discussed and learned and prayed for and mentioned in their prayers daily. These things, of course, were completely beyond the context and the lexicon of the Zionist movement. It therefore comes as no surprise that when people define themselves as religious Zionists, very often, subconsciously and unwittingly, they are limiting themselves to those concepts and notions and aspirations that the secular Zionist movement was able to express and to actively work at realizing in the real world, such as settling the land of Israel, which is why many, in fact most of the so-called religious Zionist world here in Israel, after the Yom Kippur War, identified with the Gush Emunim movement, which was for doing what? Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, for settling the land of Israel. This was a concept that many, certainly old-time, more ideologically inclined members of the Labour Party, a secular Zionist party, could also identify with. That's why there were people within the Zionist Labour Party of that time, in the 1970s, who supported the efforts of Gush Emunim, who wanted to settle Jews in the newly secured parts of Eretz Yisrael following the Six-Day War. But anything beyond the realm of that Zionist lexicon, concepts which were foreign to the secular Zionist movement, those the ones that we mentioned a moment ago, things to do with a true form of Jewish government, and discussions of pertaining to Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, and the Mikdash, the Temple, and a Sanhedrin, and many other aspects of recalibrating and redefining Judaism according to its own authentic and original concepts and definitions, things which were not possible and not therefore experienced in the Galuth, but things that can and must be done here in Eretz Yisrael. Those kinds of ideas that were not part of the Zionist ethos could not be really conceived of by religious Zionists, because they had, by defining themselves as Zionists, even albeit religious Zionists, by defining themselves in those terms, they had essentially taken upon themselves that world of ideas and aims that the Zionist movement had, as it were, sanctified, but they couldn't think beyond those boundaries. They could not think outside of that box. And this is, I think, the essential reason for what we see today, that even though today there is much more interest in the religious world with regards to things such as the Mikdash and the Sanhedrin, etc., nevertheless it is still a fact that a majority of the so-called religious Zionist world does not really identify, or is, even if they perhaps think about it in some way in their heart of hearts, they are embarrassed, as it were, and very hesitant to talk about these things and to support such activities. It is therefore my belief that defining ourselves as religious Zionists is something harmful and pernicious. It is to our own detriment. We are, as it were, tying a iron ball with a chain to our ankle and preventing ourselves from really moving forward according to those things that at some level, ideologically or religiously, we claim to believe in, things that we pray about every day, such as the Mikdash, such as true Jewish government and justice system here in Eretz Yisrael, things that we mention in the Shmoneh Esrei every day. On the other hand, by identifying with and swearing allegiance to the system known as Zionism, we are essentially making this, placing this beyond our capabilities. We are putting this beyond our reach. And therefore, it is my belief that the Jewish world, the religious Zionist, so-called religious world, has to come to the realization that we are not and never were Zionists. We are Torah Jews in Eretz Yisrael, and our frames of reference and our essential belief system and values and aims and goals as individuals and as a nation are to be defined as they always have been defined, according to the Torah, according to traditional Jewish thinking and concepts, and not according to a superficial, schizophrenic, partly assimilationist, partly Jewish, essentially secular, with a few ideas that were accepted and woven into the fabric of secular Zionism. Such a system cannot be the blueprint for the future development of the Jewish people and for our march forward into history and to achieving our divinely ordained destiny.
The production of these videos and maintaining this channel demands much time and money. If you enjoyed this video, please show your appreciation and support. To make a donation, please go to www.machonshilo.org and press the PayPal button, which appears on the upper right-hand side of the home page. To sponsor a video or purchase Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, please write us at office@machonshilo.org.